This is Transparency, a podcast by Gender Dysphoria Alliance, hosted by Aaron Kimberly and Aaron Terrell. Each week we'll be joined by people who have personal or professional experience with gender dysphoria and physical transition. We'll also discuss how our trans experiences relate to the concept of gender identity. Join us for a compassionate yet heterodox approach to the question of trans.
Dr. Paul Vasey is Professor and Board of Governors Research Chair in Culture, Organization, and Society at the University of Lethbridge in Alberta, Canada. His research has focused on understanding the development, evolution, and psychobiology of gender diversity and sexual orientation. He has studied female homosexual behavior in Japanese monkeys for the past 33 years. For 19 years, he's conducted annual fieldwork in Samoa, a culture where feminine, same-sex attracted males are identified as a third gender called fa'afafine. In 2015, Dr. Vasey established another field site in the Istmo region of Mexico. In this area, the indigenous people recognize feminine, same-sex attracted males as a third gender called Muxe. And here's our conversation with Dr. Vasey. Welcome back to Transparency, everyone. I'm Aaron Kimberly, back with my co-host, as always, Aaron Terrell, and we're very excited to have Dr. Paul Vasey with us. We've talked about your work, Paul, a number of times on our podcast, so it's great to have you on to answer some questions for us about the work that you do.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
I know that whenever I'm sure you're well aware that sometimes your work is controversial, and whenever I've mentioned some of your studies, I inevitably get some feedback and pushback on some of the concepts that you raise. And one of the things that I hear often when I talk about your work in Samoa is that people feel like that work is specific to a very specific culture, and so I really wanted to ask you, why is it that you feel it's helpful to study homosexuality in a place like Samoa, which is a fairly culture-bound, place to study?
Well, I think the same argument could be made about North America. If I was talking to those people, I would say, well, what makes you think that whatever is going on in North America can be generalized to the rest of the planet, particularly if we're talking about all of the stuff around identity. But more to the point of your question, one of the reasons I go to Samoa to study homosexuality, or as I refer to it, male androphilia. So I'm interested in a lot of things, but in terms of the research that probably I'm best known for, it focuses on biological males who are feminine and who are pretty much exclusively same-sex attracted. So they're attracted to adult males, and more specifically, masculine adult males. So they're androphilic. Androphilia means sexual attraction to adult males. But it's important to, provide that caveat that it's not just any adult male they're attracted to. It's masculinity that is the most attractive. So why do I go there? Well, we've published research in my lab that suggests that if you want to understand the evolution of male androphilia, and a lot of my work is evolutionary in content, that the best model for doing that is this feminine form of male androphilia, or what we might call transgender form. That's not a word they would use to describe themselves necessarily, but for the purposes of my work and this conversation, I'm okay using that word, because if I talk about that word with them, they sort of nod and say, well, yeah, that kind of makes sense. We can definitely see the parallels. So this paper we published suggests that it's the transgender form of male androphilia that is likely the ancestral form, the first form in terms of an evolutionary sequence, and that the cisgender form of male androphilia, which you see here, is more what in evolutionary language more derived. So it came later. So it just makes, if you're going to test evolutionary theories using the cisgender or the gay form of male androphilia, the results you get are not necessarily going to be, you might say, as accurate, as informative compared to if you're studying the transgender form. So that's one reason I go there. But another reason is that my work really focuses on what you might call the deep structure of male androphilia. I'm really interested in what are the cross-cultural universals that characterize male androphiles. So it doesn't matter how they're socialized. It doesn't matter what culture they grow up in. This deep structure is always going to be present. And so that's another reason I do the kind of cross-cultural work that I do, not only in Samoa, but in other places like a region in Mexico, in the state of Oaxaca, called the Istmo region. I work there with a similar group of individuals, feminine, same-sex attracted males, who in that particular culture are known as Muxe. So I should just say that the Fa'afafine and the Muxe, which I'll probably be talking about a lot with you guys, is they're both the reason those terms are used to refer to them is because in these particular cultures, they're not considered to be either by themselves or by others men or women. They're conceptualized as some alternative or third gender. There's different language that's used and people get really hung up on the language, but I think you get the point. And I guess another reason I work in places like Samoa and the Istmo region of Oaxaca, Mexico, and I work with these transgender male androphiles is because these cross-cultural universal correlates of male androphilia that I study and publish on, they suggest to me that we're not dealing with categorically different classes of human beings. We're dealing with individuals who represent, to use sciencey language, the same natural kind, and how that, in other words, they share the same sort of biological potential, but how that biological potential gets expressed varies depending on the culture in which they develop. And so, I've said many times publicly, if I grew up in Samoa, chances are I wouldn't look like this. I'd look far more feminine, because that's sort of the identity pathway that would be afforded to me in that particular cultural context.
I know gay men in the Western context often have a reaction to that, feeling that it's like a forced feminization.
Yeah.
But I think from the work that I've read of yours, it sounds like it's not that they're told, you have to be feminine, but they're identified as feminine and just allowed to grow up and remain feminine. Is that sort of the pathway that you're familiar with there?
Yeah, sure. So it's important to remember that gay men, on average, are more feminine than straight men. And so this is a very, very well described and well documented correlate of male androphilia. And it's one that has been identified in many, many, many different cultures around the globe. It's one of the largest male sexual orientation differences that exists, if not the largest. So I'm not saying every single gay guy can be characterized in terms of childhood sex atypicality or femininity, but what I am saying is that on average, that's the case. And so what you have, regardless of culture, you have little feminine pre-androphilic males. And In some cultures, that male femininity isn't particularly socially problematic, and they take a laissez-faire attitude to it. And those feminine pre-androphilic boys grow up to be feminine androphilic adult males. In other cultures, such as the cultures we live in, the three of us, male femininity is more problematic. And so feminine, pre-androphilic male children, defeminize and masculinize in as much as they're capable of doing so. And the end result of that is that they present as adult male androphiles in a cisgender manner, what we would call gay guys.
So rather than a cultural feminization, as a lot of Westerners would describe the Fa'afafine and the Muxe, you're basically saying it's more like what the version of male homosexuality we have here in the West is more like a cultural masculinization in response to to use the vernacular we all know, homophobia.
Yeah, I would say it's a defeminization. There's two things going on. They're defeminizing and they're masculinizing, again, in as much as they can, because we have to remember that even as adults, gay guys are more feminine on average than straight guys in terms of, for example, certain interests and personality traits. Again, I don't think I'm saying anything controversial here, because there's lots of evidence to back this up. And there's evidence from multiple different cultures to back this up. None of this stuff strikes me as controversial. I mean, some people might think it is, but look at the literature.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's not even excuse me, it's not even just scientifically. It's like this would have been self-evidently obvious and stateable, I think, until recently, with the kind of trans trend that's taken over the West. And now a lot of gay men are kind of pushing back on the fact that they are anything different than straight, again, cis men, that there is some sort of natural feminization that's happened there, and that seems to be why it's controversial now, just because and again, like, we kind of our milieu is quite gender critical, right? And so a lot of those are that, as in the backlash to the trans trend, and so a lot of that that demographic is adult gay men who are simultaneously aware that they probably would have been wrapped up in the trans child situation we've got now if they had been children, but are simultaneously adverse to the idea that there is a natural femininity to gay men. It is something, sort of a paradox that exists simultaneously.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of shame in Euro-American cultures around male femininity. Gay guys don't like to be reminded that they're more feminine on average than straight guys. And I think there's maybe another important reason for the reaction, and that's that if you're on the gay mating market, and we all know gay guys like sex, if you're on the gay male mating market, what is going to have the highest value? The highest value on the gay male mating market is going to be guys that are masculine. And so any sort of suggestion that, there might be a hint of femininity there, either in the present or the past, is going to be met with consternation.
Even in my lifetime, I'm almost 50, but I've seen an evolution in gay and lesbian presentations just in my lifetime. There
Mhm.
seemed to be a lot more gender nonconformity. Certainly in the 80s, that was probably the peak of visibility in gay and lesbian gender nonconformity. And I have a hypothesis that AIDS did a lot to stop that in its tracks, and probably forced. We've talked a lot about the disappearance of the butch lesbian, but there's also been a disappearance of the highly effeminate gay man. And it used to be, my understanding used to be a lot more common for effeminate gay men to have sex with bisexual or heterosexual men. I know the gender criticals aren't going to like me saying that, because they're going to say, well, heterosexuals wouldn't have sex with a man. But highly effeminate gay men in Asia, I'm told there are straight men that have sex with them.
Sure. So I've done some of that work, and yeah, and I think maybe Mike Bailey spoke a little bit about this to you guys, that in many of these non-Western cultures, highly feminine gay men or again, the language I prefer is androphilic males, because they don't identify as gay and they don't identify as men. So I say androphilic males. Yeah, they're the target of their sexual interest is not other feminine androphilic males, because androphilic males, regardless of whether they're transgender or cisgender, are not interested in femininity. They're interested in masculinity. And so they would target, they could potentially target cisgender male androphiles if they existed in their cultures. But those cisgender male androphiles wouldn't be interested in having sex with them because they're feminine. They're interested in socializing with them, being friends with them, but not having sex. So who's left? Well, straight guys are left, and straight guys like femininity. And I mean, you could ask yourself, well, why would a straight guy sleep with one of these feminine males? And we're talking about, people who are pretty high in terms of their femininity. There's probably a few reasons. One is they're feminine, and straight guys like that. Another is that they can be more sexually assertive, so they're more likely to flirt with these straight guys. Another reason, another possibility that, again, this is all coming from the literature. One of my former students and I just published a huge review on men who have sex with these kinds of individuals. Another reason is that they just avoid any sort of contact with their partner's penis. Maintaining that sort of image of femininity in their heads. Also, in a lot of these interactions, alcohol is involved. And so alcohol lowers inhibitions. And a lot of the guys I've interviewed, I'll ask them, like, why, what, I would ask a question like, imagine if you're given a choice between having sex with a woman or sex with Fafafine or Muxe, who would you choose? And it's very common for them to say woman first. Not always, but it's pretty common. And if I ask, well, why then would you have sex with a Fafafine? Well, part of it is they can't always get what they want. And another, but more interesting, at least for me, I find some of them go, well, sometimes you just want something different, which I think is an interesting response that deserves further study. What exactly is it they're talking about? And sometimes when I do probe a bit more deeply, they say things like, well, they're better at sex. They do more stuff. You can just kind of lay there and they take over and take you around the world, so to speak. Yeah.
What percentage of androphilic males are Fafafine?
In Samoa?
Mm-hmm.
More than 99%. It's extremely rare that I meet a cisgender male androphile. When I do, I sort of gawk at them like I'm looking at some rare species of bird, because they're so rare. They're there, but you really, really, really have to hunt for them. I did one study where I had a sample of cisgender male androphiles from Samoa, and I can't remember off the top of my head what the sample size was, but it was somewhere, I think, between 15 and 20. And that was after, really a really concerted effort to find these guys over the course of, a field season that would have been a few months. They're not common.
Is there kind of a cultural aversion to that kind of expression of homosexuality? Because I imagine there it's kind of closely like there's masculine straight men, and then there's the fa'afafine, and that femininity is associated with androphilia. So is there kind of a like our version of homophobia associated with an like an actually masculine presenting androphile?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
So I think, and the interesting thing is that sort of, if you want to call it homophobia, or
right. I didn't know another term to use. Yeah.
it's even the fa'afafine kind of express that. I remember speaking to one fa'afafine and saying, "Well, are there any like men who have sex with other men in Samoa?" And she just looked at me kind of with this look of disgust on her face and said, "I don't know, but I hope not. I mean, who would ever want to do that?" So yeah, I think there's more averse reaction to two cisgender males having sex than there would be to a cisgender straight guy and a fa'afafine, for example, having sex. I'm not saying it's accepted. When a straight guy has sex with a fa'afafine, I'm not saying it's accepted or certainly not celebrated. But I think people tend to look the other way, and it's sort of a, well, boys will be boys kind of attitude. It's just a sort of peccadillo. But I guess I should make it clear, because it often isn't for people who are having these conversations, that male femininity, it's in my opinion, it's quite well accepted in Samoa. But that doesn't mean that male homosexuality is accepted in Samoa. It's not. And the fa'afafine will often talk about, that part of their lives is not accepted.
And people tend to conflate those two things too. That when we talk about that they're allowed to just remain feminine throughout their lifetime, that as a model, that and conceptualizing that as a third sex or third gender, that model is a completely separate issue to their quality of life and social acceptance and social economic status and those kinds of things.
Yeah. Well, I would say it, and I have said it again publicly. If I was a transgender male androphile, I think Samoa would be one of the best places in the world to live. They're fa'afafine. They're. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate, but they're everywhere. You go, if you walk into a bank, the teller could be fa'afafine. If you go to a restaurant, the waitress could be a fa'afafine. If you go to the prime minister's office, the receptionist could be a fa'afafine. No one does double takes when a fa'afafine walks down the road. No one gawks. They're. I mean, as far as I can tell, and this is coming from someone who's worked there for 19 years, going on 20 years, they're very well integrated into the society and well accepted. But the sexual, so the male femininity part is very accepted, but the male sexuality part is it's looked down on. but again, you know, my experience is that Samoans are very tolerant people, and they might have some strong personal beliefs, but um, I I don't think that culturally that plays out in terms of them enforcing their beliefs on others. They might not want it for themselves, and they might, you know, sort of personally disagree with it, but they're again, my experience in Samoa is that they're very they're very tolerant.
The aversion though to the male sex act, where does that come from? Are they a religious people, or what is the what would you explain, like how is that explained? One thing that I disagreed with Mike Bailey on is I believe that there is some level of innate homophobia, innate aversion to same-sex sexual acts. I believe that that does exist on a certain level, and I'm wondering if that's where that's coming from, or if it is from a religious connotation of man should lie with woman and nothing else.
Well, I mean, yes. If you, I've never met a, well, maybe once. I was going to say I've never met a Samoan who doesn't declare that they're religious and that they are a member of some religion. Recently, I met one guy that that said he was atheist. Actually, I'm using he pronouns. He's a fa'afafine, and he's cisgender, so he's one of those rare exceptions. I guess he's exceptional too in terms of his declaring he's atheist.
He's prone to contrarianism, apparently. I like him.
I don't know. I've never sat down and interviewed him. I don't think I have. So I haven't asked those questions. So I think part of it maybe is, you know, some biblical rule against homosexuality that's driving those attitudes. I get where Mike is coming from, and I'm really sympathetic to it because I've seen it with my own eyes how cross-culturally variable heterosexual men's willingnesses to have sex with feminine males. Of course, that's not something we see in North America, really.
I think we do, though.
Maybe
I think
maybe it depends on where we are.
yeah.
You know, maybe if you're in Seattle or Portland or somewhere over there in your area of the world, you will get these urban communities of guys that are more, what do they call it, hetero
flexible. No, but what I'm referring to more is I think it's kind of universal, the otherwise heterosexual males' propensity to have sex with other males who they perceive as feminine or just sexually willing, sexually available. And I think that is quite universal, but I think also what is mostly universal is also a general aversion to that practice, or to male, like men are gonna basically have sex with whatever's available, basically, and I think even if they are kind of on a general level more or a cultural level, or I don't know what the word is, but like averse to they're still going to engage in it if it's available and it's the only thing that's available, I think, is where I'm coming from. And I think that's universal. Whereas I think those men, say in my, so liberal pockets of the world, are just going to be able to embrace the label of bisexuality as cultural credit. Whereas in other parts of the world, they're just going to keep that, very, very under wraps. I'm not sure if that makes sense.
I guess I'm not convinced that straight guys will kind of go with whatever is available. That hasn't been my observation in North America. I know straight guys who are they're not homophobic, they're not transphobic, but they're highly averse to the idea of having sex with a guy. And probably it's important to remember that there's a significant, in terms of the research we've done on this topic of straight guys having sex with fa'afafine, there's a significant minority of guys who only have sex with women. They're exclusively opposite sex attracted. Yeah. So yeah, I'm skeptical about
Sorry,
how.
I didn't mean to imply that every male. I just meant that the propensity for that is much higher, I think, than most people would realize. That's what I was saying. It's like not every male is going to sleep with, like not everyone's prison by, as the controversial term goes. But I think that the propensity is high.
I think we just really don't. I mean, it's fascinating. I believe that heterosexual guys' willingness to sleep with feminine males is extremely cross-culturally variable. Why that is, though, we don't really know. We've speculated that maybe if you're growing up in one of these cultures where feminine males like Fa'afafine are present in your environment as you're developing, then that impacts your willingness to recognize them as potential sexual partners. But I mean, that's just speculation at this point. So there's a lot more research that has to be done to kind of nail down why that cross-cultural variability exists. But going back to a point you said earlier about, is there something biological going on here? I think maybe it is easier to elicit disgust or aversion in heterosexual men to the idea of gay sex because it wouldn't have been evolutionarily advantageous for them to engage in that kind of sex, and it would be evolutionarily advantageous for them to have some sort of a cognitive mechanism that makes them avoid those sorts of interactions. So I'm sympathetic to both possibilities. I just think we need, and it could be a combination of the two. I just think we need more research.
You mentioned the word pronouns. I'm curious, do the Fa'afafine use male or female pronouns?
They use both. So people switch back and forth all the time. People will refer to a highly feminine Fa'afafine as he or she, and there's absolutely no offense taken. It's not an issue in Samoa. They often, those that are aware of these sorts of controversies that are going on in North America or in Europe, they often just shake their heads and think, why would people be concerned about those sorts of things? So yeah, I mean, I recognize in North America, that's an issue that is important for people, but it's not an issue that is cross-culturally universal. It's not a concern that's cross-culturally universal.
I think in the controversy that we're seeing here, I think that the concept of a third, sort of a metaphorical third space or third gender, I think could be a potential solution we could move towards. Because it's I don't know how else we're going to resolve this ongoing culture war.
Yeah, I've avoided sort of speaking about that because I don't know how feasible it would be to sort of take one cultural model and then overlay it onto another culture. But recently, in terms of all of these controversies surrounding women's spaces, for example, I have thought, well, if we had a system like Samoa, maybe we wouldn't have some of these problems because Fa'afafine don't identify as women, for example. But that said, I'm skeptical about the degree to which sort of third gender identities could take hold in North America. I mean, we're all socialized, right, to believe that there are in a Euro-American context to believe that there are men and women, and you grow up identifying in that manner, and it becomes very much part of who you are and how you think about yourself and how you present and how you sort of go forth in the world. So regardless of whether you're cisgender or transgender. And so I totally understand how that sense of self would be important for people. And the idea of saying to certain people, I'm assuming we're talking about certain trans individuals now, well, actually, you're a third gender and you should, think of yourself that way. I suspect that would be a pretty tough sell, and you might be asking people to do the impossible because that's not how they conceptualize who they are.
Yeah, it's equally a tough sell though to assert that we literally have changed sex. So this is why I feel like that a metaphorical third space seems like a compromise between these two very polarized views, where neither side is budging and willing to change how they're conceptualizing biological sex.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you're basically talking about objective reality. You can't change your sex. But that said, what do we do with highly feminine males and highly masculine females who, I suspect that in any cultural context, most people would recognize their femaleness or recognize their maleness, but think, well, they're not really a man, or they're not really a woman. They're something else. And in a Samoan cultural context, what happens when that maleness is coupled with a high degree of femininity is, they're not a man and they're not a woman. They're something else. Yeah.
Speaking of females in that case, I know it's not your area of expertise, but what is the female equivalent there? Is there such a thing, or I understand that there is, but I'm not really clear.
Yeah, they're called fa'atama, which means in the manner of a man. So fa'a means in the manner of, and tama means man. So yes, they're there. They're far less prevalent than fa'afafine, which to me is
tracks in the West too. Yeah,
exactly. I suspect that is just a cross-cultural universal. No matter where you go in the world, masculine gynophilic females, so females that are natal females that are attracted to other females, they're going to be less numerous than the feminine androphilic males. I suspect that will be shown to be a cross-cultural universal. And there are people doing more work in that area recently. Doug Vanderlyn at the University of Toronto, he's going to be coming out with some papers on masculine, same-sex attracted females in Thailand. In my lab, we're going to be coming out with some papers in the next little while on, I guess, trans men. That would be the term I would use, and to a lesser extent, lesbians, because they're harder to find these days than trans men in Iran. So we're just submitting starting to submit those papers now. So just back to your question, they exist, but there are these interesting differences, and I see, and again, I think these are cross-cultural universals that you see in other places, like where I work in Mexico, and you see them in North America. So you have these same-sex attracted masculine females, but they seem to be much less visible than the feminine male androphiles. which is kind of, don't you think? I mean, it's sort of reminiscent of North America, where gay guys are they're much more public. And I guess the other thing I noticed there is that there is like a Fa'afafine, you might say a Fa'afafine community, right? But I don't get the sense that the Fa'atama community is as cohesive or as stable. I mean, that could in part be due to discrimination, which I think Fa'atama experience more than Fa'afafine. Because
that's different than the West, I would say.
Yeah, because masculine females are less accepted. But it could also be due to some sort of personality traits which make masculine females less interested in the kind of formation of public social communities and public social spaces that characterizes androphilic males everywhere in the world.
The smaller numbers are going to make that more difficult as well.
Exactly,
if they're sparse and scattered across the country.
Absolutely. And in fact, I agree with you completely, but I would say the exact same thing for Fa'afafine. So, a lot of the work I do is in the capital, Pia, because Fa'afafine gravitate to the capital. There are economic opportunities there. And probably another thing that makes them gravitate to the capital is there's opportunities to have all kinds of fun there, going out to clubs and going out to bars and socializing with other groups of Fa'afafine. So when I go to the villages, and I do spend a lot of time in the villages, the Fa'afafine just aren't as prevalent, and you might have a Fa'afafine or two in one village, and then maybe one Fa'afafine in the next village, and none in the next village, and two in the next village. So there is this sort of diffusion, and it is interesting to think about what it would have been like prior to urbanization. How would these people, who obviously have similar interests, how would they have gotten together to form some sort of tiny little communities? I spoke once with my partner is he self-identifies as Fa'afafine. He's cisgender, though. Again, he's one of these rare exceptions. I spoke with his uncle, who lived out in one of the villages. He passed away a few years ago, but before he did, I used to like to hang out with him. He was Fa'afafine as well, and also, interestingly enough, he was also cisgender. But he would talk about what it was like. He was in his 80s at this time, and he would talk about what it was like way back in the day. And yeah, there's this challenge of how do you form community when individuals are so diverse. But nevertheless, people did find each other, and he would describe to me parties, and it sounded great. It sounded like there was this really, really nice sense of belonging and just fun. Yeah. So
with that being said, with as far as the social integration, so these very highly effeminate gay men, are they primarily socializing with straight women, or like, how do they fit socially in their social circles?
Are we talking about Samoa?
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, it's really cool in Samoa because I don't get the sense that straight guys have any sort of discomfort around socializing with Fa'afafine. They're very integrated into the society, and they're not sort of marked as being like socially problematic. That's what comes to mind. So yeah, I mean, straight guys they just treat them like any other person. They're no more remarkable. I think I wrote once, they're no more remarkable than your standard issue men and women. So they're friends with women, but they're friends with straight guys, and they're friends with other. They're all of those things happen. Yeah.
Do you think
when
that's
you say that
facilitated?
there's
Sorry, I keep cutting you off, Aaron. Go ahead.
I just think I'm curious about this. You keep mentioning that some people are both fa'afafine and cisgender. What do you mean by that?
I mean, they are fa'afafine in the sense that they identify as fa'afafine, which in a Samoan cultural context means that they're something other than men and women. But there are a handful who are cisgender, by which I mean they look more or less like me. So is that clear? Or
do you mean like they're androphilic, but they integrate into society as men? Like what?
Well, no, they wouldn't be. They'd be seen as being fa'afafine. So let me give you another example. So this is probably not known to most people, but where I work in southern Mexico, there are same-sex attracted males who are known as Muxe, and they are and Muxe are considered to be neither men nor women. They're like this alternative gender, this third gender. So probably most people, when I say that, they think of feminine same-sex attracted males, which in the group of people there are called the Istmo Zapotec, which in Istmo Zapotec culture would be referred to as Muxe Guna. So these would be transgender androphilic males. But there's another type of Muxe in Istmo Zapotec society, which is, as far as I can tell, pretty much as common as the transgender form, and that's the cisgender form. And if you looked at these individuals, you'd think, well, they're cisgender, they're same-sex attracted, and they're natal males. So looks like a gay guy to me. But in that cultural context, what that cluster of traits means is that they're not men or not women. They're a type of Muxe, and they're called Muxe Ingiu. So there's Muxe Guna, the transgender ones, and Muxe Ingiu, the cisgender ones. In Samoa, so it's interesting, just to finish up with that, it's interesting because here you have a situation where you have cisgender individuals in terms of their presentation, but we might say they were transgender in terms of their identity. In Samoa, there is no division like that. Although sometimes someone might say, oh, he's a fa'afafine kama, which means he's a boy fa'afafine as opposed to a fa'afafine genge, which would be a girl fa'afafine. So some people, like my partner, for example, he identifies as a fa'afafine, but he is cisgender in a somewhat similar vein to the Muxe Ingiu, which I just described to you. So his presentation is cisgender, but I guess you could say his identity is transgender because he's adopting this third gender identity. I mean, we've never sat down and had a heart-to-heart about this, but I'm just speculating what he might say. I know he would say for sure, I am a fa'afafine, and I've never heard him ever identify as gay, ever. But it's not it's not like we sit around and discuss this
hash
stuff.
out identities.
No, he's not. I mean, he's supportive of my research, but I don't think he's particularly interested. Like I think, I mean, yeah, it's like, that's okay. You go away and do your data collection and your thing and have fun.
I know some people take offense to the idea that because you're androphilic, that it's almost like you're cast out of the male category. That's how they interpret this idea of a third category, that you can't be male as long as you're androphilic. But I wonder to what extent
a man. So you're male.
Yes. If you're male and androphilic, you can't be a man. So that's how they interpret that, is rather. But I wonder to what extent the third category actually facilitates their social inclusion and integration.
Well, I think as we discussed earlier, male femininity is accepted in Samoa. It's tolerated. I would say it's accepted. I don't think it's celebrated like you any more than being a man or a woman is, but it's accepted. So I guess you might say that category facilitates that integration, because people can say, oh, that's what that individual is. So perhaps there's something to what you're saying.
A way of making sense of that, maybe.
If we could just go back for a second to what you said earlier about some people are offended, I would just say, well, they probably don't want to do cross-cultural research then, because there's a whole world of diversity in terms of how people think. And if your level of offense is contingent on everybody thinking like you or like your culture, then well, so much for cultural diversity and so much for doing research on cultural diversity.
How common is medicalization in Samoa?
It's not common. No, I know maybe, and you have to keep in mind, I've been doing the research now for we're going on 20 years now. I've maybe run across 2 or 3 fa'afafine who have had sex reassignment surgery. I'm not even sure if that's the lingo I should be using, so I apologize if that's some people are upset by that. But and I know a handful of fa'afafine who they'll say they take tablets. That's how they describe it, to elicit some breast growth. The breast growth is minimal, in my opinion. They have, what you might describe as breast buds. And I think the tablets that they're talking about are birth control tablets that they take. I know a couple fa'afafine like that, but we're talking about, in both cases, we're talking about far less than 1% out of the hundreds of fa'afafine I've interviewed. And most of the time, if I ask fa'afafine, I did one study where I asked about, if the money was available, would you have a sex change? And the vast majority said no. And when I asked why, they said, oh, I can just do it like this. That's how they talk about it.
Yeah, if their needs are being met and they're integrated in society, there wouldn't be the incentive to medicalize like there would be in the West.
Yeah, and if they're able to get sexual partners, and also if there's a gendered category of personhood into which they can be slotted and into which they can slot themselves, which doesn't require medicalization, then you put all that stuff together and it's just very, very rare. And I should note too that if somebody does get a sex change and they come back to Samoa, absolutely no one considers them to be a woman. No one. Once a fa'afafine, always a fa'afafine, as someone said to me, another fa'afafine. Yeah, you So I guess they would subscribe to the idea that you can't change sex. You can masculinize or feminize your body, but you can't literally change sex. Yeah. I get.
Yeah, and if you're not going back to a culture that tells you you're a woman, that also, negates a lot of the drive. Go on.
Sorry.
Oh, I was saying if you're obviously returning to a culture that's not going to, participate in a fantasy of you being the opposite sex, there also diminishes the drive to alter your body to approximate the opposite sex.
Yeah, I guess I hadn't thought of it that way, but yeah, I think there's something there. Again, like, I'm not saying, and therefore this is how it should be in North America. That's not where any of this is coming from. In North America, the situation is very different. There isn't another category that people can slot themselves into and feel good about themselves. Like, I think Fa'afafine, they take pride in being Fa'afafine, because they're sort of known for taking care of the family, and, they derive a lot of pride from that. They're known for being good at certain jobs like decorating, and they take a lot of pride in that. We don't have a similar kind of situation in North America. And so if you're a masculine natal female, a very masculine natal female, or a very feminine natal male, and you're not comfortable with what identity categories have been attributed to you, then there's only one way to go, and that's to flip the switch and become a member of the other gendered category that's available. I mean, I get that that's changing somewhat, and there's more gender fluidity in North America, and people are identifying in other ways. But I mean, you guys would know better than I would the degree to which that's the case in the trans community. How many people are adopting these alternative identities as opposed to the traditional man-woman ones?
It seems the people who are adopting the more like the whole non-binary categorization, they seem to just be mostly heterosexual, typically heterosexual women or adolescent girls. Because again, for a similar reason is that it's some way to differentiate yourself and to be something that's currently celebrated. It really doesn't seem to have anything to do with innate gender feelings at all. It's more about having a cultural designation that you can be celebrated for. That seems to be.
Are you talking about the adolescent females with what's been called rapid onset gender dysphoria? Is that what you're referring to, or more general?
No, it's even more general than that. It's more of a cultural designation that just means you're not cis, and it very much has nothing to do, even with rapid onset gender dysphoria, they're still feeling bodily distress that they're trying to escape, that trans seems to be the solution for, or really even the cause for. But with non-binary, the third designation, it seems to be much less about an individual's body or their sexual orientation, and much more about just not being a boring cis straight person. It's some kind of it's a cultural designation primarily that exists in very liberal parts of the West, where it just means that you're somehow hip with not being boring. It has very little to do with gender or sexuality, I found, and more to do with just being something interesting, being punk rock, essentially.
Yeah. I guess that's another kind of important distinction between Euro-American societies versus some of the places I work, like Samoa, or among the Istmo Zapotec, is that they're lower, I would say, on dimensions of individuality, and higher on collectivism. So this phenomena we see in North America of people wanting to express themselves as individuals and define details of their gender or sexuality in this minute manner, and then have have it validated by others. You don't really see that in these places. Yeah, I think those kinds of people would find it very difficult functioning in Samoa, because that kind of demand for hyper individualized recognition would be mocked.
Right, right. Well, and I don't even think it's that those individuals, it is the culture that they're raised in, right? So if you're raised in a culture that values your purpose within the group and like that has collectivist values, you're going to find purpose and meaning and, you know, self-fulfillment in fitting into and being useful to the collection. But in an individualized society, you're going to try to find a way that makes you, you know, stand out as an individual, because that's what the community is gonna celebrate. So I think this stuff arises simply because of just way too much individual celebration of individualism.
That sort of very public focus on who I am as an individual. Let me break it down for you at great length. That would never fly in Samoa. People would be making fun of that very, very quickly.
I just have one final question for you. In terms of, so we've talked at length about highly feminized androphilic men, masculinized same-sex attracted females. How does that track into some of your work with other primates?
Okay, so you're asking about the Japanese macaque work. So I have a totally separate stream of research that has been going on for like 33 years, or I think 33 years, a long time, more than 3 decades. And it focuses primarily on understanding why female Japanese macaques, or what people might know as snow monkeys, why they engage in homosexual behavior, at least in certain groups, such as the one I study, which the group I study is called Arashiyama. It's on the outskirts of Kyoto. So I've spent lots and lots of my life watching monkeys have sex. And how does it link in? I guess it just links in terms of a general interest in why do non-reproductive sexual behaviors exist? So those are questions about potentially, function, evolution, and if they're not functional, how do they come to be? And so lots of the Japanese macaque work is focused on asking those kinds of questions. And then also a sort of type of question that people might not think about so much, which is one that I find really fascinating. What are the consequences of having these individuals in your social environment? Because they're not just inert, right? They're their own active agents. And what are the consequences of having a transgender androphilic male in your group? Or so I'm interested in those kinds of evolutionary questions when it comes to both non-human animals, particularly primates, and humans. The sort of connection between the two isn't seamless, though, because in half of my life I've spent studying female sexuality in Japanese monkeys, but the other half of my professional life I spent studying same-sex sexuality in males, be it in the transgender or cisgender form.
Well, thanks so much for sharing your time with us. It's been fascinating.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here. It's been awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Transparency Podcast. If you enjoy our content, please help out our algorithm by hitting like or subscribe. If you'd like to make a donation, follow the link to our PayPal account. On behalf of the Gender Dysphoria Alliance, thanks for your support.